which is, what sort of questions are there about what form the socialist struggle should take? And that's ultimately what all these different groups are trying to answer. They're trying to figure out what are the answers to these questions, because various things have been tried at various points in history. And, we haven't gotten rid of global capitalism yet, so nobody has been 100% successful. But there have been wins, there have been successes, but there's also been failures. And so, what can we learn from all these things? And three big points of difference, which I would call the kind of three key questions to ask about what our socialist struggle should take, come from this one essay, The Utopian Impulse by Dan Chodorkov. One of them is class analysis. So, all socialists recognize this kind of class structure of the wealthy over the working class. But there's kind of disagreement on exactly what that looks like. There's different layers to it that are complicated by various other factors, including, racism and sexism and various things. In the US, when you hear Bernie Sanders talk, for example, even when he talks about the wealthy and the top 1%, he still talks about the middle class. And, well, okay, the middle class, but what about the bottom? What about the working class? And so, there's all these structures to the class struggle that we have to consider. And we have to consider, who we're reaching out to and with what message. If we're trying to build a socialist society that works for everyone, because we have to recognize that some folks benefit from this society, and they're not going to be the ones that are going to join, our struggle, or at least not at the beginning, because they benefit from this.
And as we organize, our own socialist projects, it's important to look around the room and say, who are we?
Yeah.
Because when we talk about the victories of socialism, the 40-hour work week, worker protections, all these kind of things that happen, those came from working class movements for the most part. Sure, there were intellectuals and theorists who were writing newspaper articles and things like that, who were putting out ideas, but they were working class movements, based within the worker, within the lowest of the low of the workers in many cases.
Yeah.
But when you look at socialist movements post-Red Scare, what we often see are an intellectual class making up most of the movement, right? Socialist movements, and I will say it's moving away from this, right? The trend and the speed, the trend, and including in the Green Party, is moving away from a educated middle class base, and then a big part of that is that we got the appeasement of the New Deal, and it gave people a little bit more of a buffer, a little bit more, some people, because it should be noted that in many of these programs that came out during the New Deal or post New Deal, they were very racially segregated. How the money was allocated often left out working class communities in favor of the burgeoning middle class communities and the growing suburbs and things like that. But in that post-purge, post-war period, much of socialism was an academic, somewhat comfortable base, and it's not surprising that such a base did not necessarily lead to a growth in the movement. It may have led to a growth of ideas. It may have led to a growth in theory and strategy. But when it came to actual wins and actual material gains, that's a period where we see the left continuing to shrink. And I think when you look at, luckily, thankfully, in recent years, last decade maybe or so, we're seeing a hard, and that this coincides with the rise of neoliberalism. As neoliberalism has rose, we're seeing more and more of the working class becoming engaged in socialist projects and socialist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you had mentioned that it looks different in different parts of the country, and in the highly industrialized Pittsburgh area, or the, used to be highly industrialized with steel and coal and things like that. You see an interesting change here where, when you talk about this class analysis, the U.S. has largely shifted from a very industrial manufacturing based economy to now it's there's a lot of service jobs. And so you end up with this interesting dynamic here where when folks talk about unions, for example, and getting the working class, the existing unions for the steel industry and things like that have actually shifted to very conservative standpoints. Because they're about protecting their industry jobs that have the benefit of a union that has existed for a long time. So they make, relatively good wages with good healthcare and all this stuff, and they don't want to lose it. Versus the service workers, restaurant workers and things that are still making tipped wages, and they don't have unions to advocate for them. So I think, there's an important aspect to this analysis that needs to inform how we organize ourselves.
And many of our modern unions that still exist today are representing exploitative industries in terms of the the environment. It's why you see the AFL-CIO constantly backing pipelines, right? Because they prioritize a small number of construction jobs for their union members over the future of the planet. Right, that's a conscious decision that the AFL-CIO consistently makes, and that then ties into what Garrett said earlier when we were talking about unions and they're kind of attaching themselves to the Democratic Party, right? A few years ago, I was helping organize some Dakota Access Pipeline rallies and events, and one of them we were marching we had our rally and then we marched to different places that supported the Dakota Access Pipeline. Well, I put the AFL-CIO on the list, and the liberals in the group threw a fit. They did not want to protest. They did not want to protest the AFL-CIO. The same thing happened when the climate strike protests were happening a few years ago. I got contacted by some people about helping put on a climate strike in our town, and they were Democrats who I was talking to. And we said at the very beginning we need to be honest about where our lines are and supporting things. And so they said we should have our Democratic governor J.B. Pritzker speak. And I said, you crossed my line. And then they said, why? And I said, J.B. Pritzker is not only an investor, but a principal partner in Energy Transfer Solutions, who is behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? He's not just an investor. He's one of the largest investors in ever, period, when it comes to building that pipeline. I said his entire portfolio is oil and gas and defense industry, and then Hyatt, which is what his family owns, right? His family owns a hotel chain, and he makes his money by exploiting workers. And so I said, this is crossing the line, right? He may speak good on the climate, but his investment portfolio says otherwise. And all of a sudden, I never got another call. I was just completely cut out of the planning, and it actually never happened, right? Because when it came down to it, they weren't willing to challenge the status quo.
Right. Yeah, I see a lot of this in Pittsburgh where, those old manufacturing jobs and steel and things like that, they've pivoted to do a lot of oil and gas work. And especially Pittsburgh and Allegheny County is a very Democratic run county and city. So all these unions are supporting all these Democratic politicians that are all for oil and gas and fracking and plastics, and they're trying to build a giant petrochemical facility not that far out of Pittsburgh that's going to completely destroy our water and air and drastically accelerate climate emissions. But that's being pushed for by the unions, by the Democratic Party, because they're propping up capitalism. And the reason they claim to support it is because of jobs, but it's like 100 jobs. They're going to destroy the planet, at a very minimum, destroy the county of over 1 million people because like 100 people in oil and gas, like to have their job. Like we can restructure this way better and make sure everyone's taken care of. So I guess shouldn't dwell there too much more. But so let's see, socialist struggle. So there's a class analysis question. There's an organizational analysis, which is you could sort of talk about it as centralized versus decentralized. How much of a central structure you want versus how much of a decentralized structure you want, which is kind of an autonomy question, right? Like, do your small local groups, do they have more autonomy to make their own decisions and actions, or do you want everything coordinated by a central committee of some kind? And that's an important question because there's been problems with both. You have to be very careful about how you're implementing things. And sort of related to that is the third question of the role of the state. A lot of folks that come from more of a Marxist perspective, there's this kind of a concept, a murky concept of like a transitional worker state. And that was a big sticking point with the anarchists who said, if there's any kind of state, there's going to be a problem. We need to just shift directly to our socialist society. And, so that's a big question of how do you do that? And if you have to have a worker state, well, how do you do that? Because a lot of the worker states that have existed in history, the Soviet Union and things, have not actually worked out. And related to that is a question of, how does electoralism play into whatever other actions that we're doing? Some folks want to do electoralism, some completely swear it off. And, the question is, what is that role? How much should we do or not do? And, these are all somewhat open questions because nobody completely has the answers yet. Although by trying to fuse together some of the most important analysis and critiques of, Marxists and anarchists and looking at, real world revolutions and what happened, we could try to put together kind of a path forward to at least ideas that we should try next. And I think that's what informs a lot of green socialism about where we should go next.
Yeah, and I've spent, let's see, I grew up with Republican parents, and at 11, I read Machiavelli's The Prince, and then I moved on to Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and then at 12, I picked up the Manifesto. And that at that point was when I started calling myself, a leftist and anti-capitalist. I actually didn't start using the word socialist until I joined the Green Party, because when I was growing up young, socialists were right, the right wing, in terms of the left. It was like the right flank of the left, and that was largely because of things like the Socialist Party in France, that is basically gone now, and in all practical purposes, and it's gone because it moved liberal. Right, it really was just a social democratic party that was using the word socialism. So when I was younger, I was an ANCOM. I was a bottom lefter. I was an anarcho-communist. But I've always considered myself a Marxist. And there's some really key reasons why. The dialectics, the process, the methodology is part of it. But for me, that transitional worker state is part of it. I don't see a way to do it without. What it looks like is a whole other story, but I often tell Greens, like, that's the role we need to be kind of trying to push ourselves into, right? We can have a violent revolution, or we can have fascism. Like, those are the things, that are on the table, and the middle road is a transitional state that the Green Party can attempt to insert itself as. And I'll say too, really day by day, year after year, I move further and further away from the idea that we just go straight to decentralized socialism, right? That we go straight to anarchism. And a big reason is the climate crisis. Maybe when these ideas were first coming, we had time to rearrange a million little communes that would move to work with each other and overcome the climate crisis. And there was certainly a time when that was, something I would have seen as a viable tactic. But when I look at the world today, we've got 8 years, less than 8 years before we hit a no turning point at 2030 with levels. It's going to take a centralized response. And then this is kind of the teetering thing between some of the tendencies that happens is like, how long is the transitional state?
Right.
Right. That obviously there has to be an end, but at the same time, the changes that we're talking about aren't just policy; they're cultural, they're generational. So it's also likely not going to be a rapid transition, right? To completely retool the economy around an eco-socialist Green New Deal like Howie proposed, that was a 10-year proposal that required a strong central state to kind of not only push off the climate, not only push off the wrong word, not only to try to defend ourselves against, the coming climate catastrophe, but also to address issues of spiraling inequality and, white supremacy and racism and sexism and ableism and all the things, right? I'm not, especially on climate, the more time that goes by, the more I'm like, there's got to be a centralized solution, and then we come into that eternal debate of when does it dissolve, right?
Yep.
I'm a Marxist. I'm a very orthodox Marxist in this sense, where I believe that the transitional state is necessary, but I also believe that it should dissolve. That's a lot of top lefters, a lot of Leninists and MLMs, Marxist Leninist Maoists. They don't want the state to dissolve. They want state power to be the central mover. So it's a weird. The climate has done some weird things to my positions as time went on, and it became more drastic. But
that's an important topic. It's an existential crisis, and so we have to think differently than we have in history. So